When I started this series on my channel, I didn't think I would be able to find so many strange photos with dark context behind them. So in this video, I want to talk specifically about some photos that I found on the internet, that through them we can find stories and things that border on atrocities. So already comment scary in the video to help with engagement, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That said, let's go to the video. In July 2003, a young man was on a trip with his friends through the forest when they met a woman. They chatted for a while, and since each had to go their separate ways, the group of young people took a photo of that woman to remember the trip. In the photo, she appears smiling. So what is behind this photo, right? Well, Geraldine Largay, 66, was that woman. She was a nurse and a very loving grandmother. Her whole family loved her, and Geraldine was so kind and loving to people that they affectionately called her Jerry. I'm not sure why specifically, but in articles about her, I found this nickname. One of Jerry's pastimes was always being surrounded by nature, and hiking was one of her favorite activities for many years. Not long ago, Jerry had retired. Her family had moved a few years earlier, so Jerry, along with her husband George, was looking for a new place to settle. One of the things Jerry used to do was go with her family to the woods, admiring the flowers, trees, and wildlife for hours. Jerry even joined a group related to the environment because of her fascination with nature. So moving forward a few months, one of Jerry's biggest dreams was to walk the Appalachian Trail, a 3,500-kilometer trek that goes from Maine to Georgia. So in 2022, Jerry decided to fulfill this dream. The problem is that this would be the last time Jerry was seen. No one knew what happened, but the most shocking part came later. So what is behind this story? To better understand what happened, we need more details. The Appalachian Trail, with its 3,500 kilometers length, is known as the longest in the United States. Jerry had marked this route as one of the most important on her bucket list. Thus, from the beginning 2013, Jerry was planning this trip. She not only gathered information on how to traverse this place, but also prepared herself physically, and at 66 years old, she decided to embark on this adventure. To grasp the magnitude of this journey, the route Jerry wanted to take was one that could take between 5 to 7 months for an experienced person to complete. On the way, proper equipment and clothes for different seasons are required. Learning to ration food is also necessary, and the weather is always unpredictable. To resupply, it was possible to leave the trail and find certain camps or establishments. In a way, one could say that despite seeming like madness, this place was a safe route. And in Jerry's case, she wasn't going alone. Jane Lee, one of her close friends, accompanied her for a few months. Both crossed the Appalachians, but at one point in the journey, Jane had to abandon the adventure due to a family emergency. Jerry thought that continuing alone would be easy since they had done all the preparation up to that point. In fact, only 321 kilometers were left to complete the route. This should be easy, Jerry thought. The only problem was that she hated walking alone. One of her biggest fears was getting lost in nature. Whenever she went to the woods or out exploring, she needed someone to accompany her. So in the following 3 weeks, Jerry continued alone on the Appalachian Trail. At one of these points, she met the group of young people who took that photo of her. Throughout the journey, she communicated with her family, informing them every time she covered a certain amount of kilometers. Similarly, every time she covered a large stretch, she met George at some points where she resupplied and spent a night in some motel. One of those days was July 22nd. Jerry tried to send a message to George, saying that she was in trouble and that he should contact the authorities to request a rescue. But the problem was that Jerry's phone started losing signal. For hours, she tried to call and send messages, but none of them reached George. At this point, she tried to head to hills or elevated areas to see if the signal would return. But nothing worked. In fact, for almost 24 hours, she desperately tried to send messages to George. Eventually, the phone battery started to run out. So Jerry thought she should save the battery, since the next day, when George realized she wasn't on the route, he would quickly try to contact her, or at least the authorities would be contacted. She decided to turn off the phone and turn it back on later when she was supposed to meet George. A little later, she began to walk, trying to see if she was close to any road. Soon, she found an area under some trees where she pitched her tent. She also hung a reflective blanket on one of the trees in case a helicopter passed by. Later, she started burning some tree bark to create something like a smoke signal. She waited, and more later that day, George, waiting for her at the meeting point, realized she hadn't appeared. Desperate, he contacted the authorities, who initiated a large search to find her. The terrible part is that Jerry was only 2 kilometers from the trail, so she was not far from where she needed to be. But due to the density of the forest, she couldn't know. In the following 2 weeks, helicopters, planes, people on horseback, hunters, and many others joined the search, but they couldn't find her. After almost 2 weeks of searching, the authorities closed the search, believing they would never find her again. During this time, Jerry stayed at her camp, thinking that the best way to survive was to stay in one place. She was quite confident that she would soon be found. In her diary, she wrote down everything that happened and even wrote letters to every member of her family. But the worst happened later, when in her writings, Jerry went from positive thoughts to accepting the reality that no one would find her. The last entry in Jerry's diary said, "When they find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It would be a great gesture for him to know that I'm dead and where I was found. No matter how many years pass, please kindly send the contents of this bag to one of them." So what happened after that? Let's move forward a bit in time, specifically to October 2015. That month, a man decided to explore a forest area belonging to the United States Navy when he suddenly found a tent. This tent belonged to Jerry. The tent was collapsed, and inside it was the woman in her sleeping bag with the diary on her chest. The diary was organized and clean until the end of her life. After this, the authorities retrieved the body, and the medical examiner concluded that Jerry managed to survive for about 26 days until she eventually died of hunger. As her last vestiges, her diary remained, and this photo, which undoubtedly turned into a very sad story. In England, at the beginning of the 15th century, Dorothy Walpole married Charles Sand, a secretary of the British state and director of British foreign policy. After the wedding, both moved to a mansion known as Raynham Hall, and it seemed that the two were very happy. But there was a detail. Charles was known for being ill-tempered and sometimes became violent. It's not known whether he ever did something to Dorothy, but something happened a few years after the wedding. Dorothy began to have an affair with another man. For a time, she managed to keep it a secret, but eventually Charles found out. Given those traits I mentioned, you can imagine his reaction, right? To punish his wife, Charles decided to lock her in a small, dirty room, practically isolated from the rest of the house. So Dorothy became a kind of prisoner. As the months passed, she began to fall ill and suffer greatly. Charles only told his staff to give her food and that he was tired of Dorothy. In fact, he didn't care about her life anymore. He only wanted to torment her as much as possible. Years later, in 1726, something happened, and this is where the story gets mysterious. It's not exactly known what happened to Dorothy, but they say she died of smallpox. Since this happened many years ago, we can't know the truth well. In fact, many people believe Dorothy was murdered by Charles. To this day, this case remains a mystery. But here's where we get to a strange event that would occur many years later. In 1835, the Touchant family organized a big Christmas party at Raynham Hall. There were several high society guests, and one of them was Colonel Loftus. Along with several other guests, he stayed at the mansion for a few nights. The party ended, and everyone went to rest. But a few hours later, while everyone was sleeping, the colonel left his room to go to the bathroom. As he walked back, he noticed a woman's silhouette at the end of one of the dark hallways of the mansion. The colonel couldn't see who she was clearly, but as he walked back to his room, the woman's features began to appear clearer. He noticed she was a young woman dressed in a brown gown. There was nothing special about her, so he didn't give it much importance. The next night, something similar happened. Loftus got up to go to the bathroom, and on his way back, he saw the same woman at the end of the hallway. While walking to his room, the woman began to approach. He thought she would just pass him to go to the bathroom, But as she got closer, he realized her face was terrifying. Loftus described that instead of eyes, the woman had just dark cavities. Her expression was of suffering, and her skin was extremely pale. As soon as he saw her, Loftus was terrified. He locked himself in his room and tried to sleep. He couldn't understand what he had seen. The next day, Loftus told everything to the Tachent family and the other guests. Everyone was shocked and didn't know how to react. The colonel was a skeptical and military man, so seeing him scared really made people surprised. When telling this story, another man commented that he had seen exactly the same thing a few nights before. This caused panic in the Tachent mansion, and several guests never returned for a visit. But the story doesn't end here. A year later, in 1836, the rumors and speculations about the ghostly woman had gained fame. The specter was now called the Brown Lady. Many skeptics didn't believe in any of these rumors. One of them was Captain Frederick Marryat, a British Navy officer. He decided to stay in the mansion to prove that the legend of the Brown Lady was false, claiming that the legend was just a tale to keep people away from the region. The last things they remembered that day were seeing the pale-faced brown lady with an expression of suffering. The captain tried to get his weapon and shoot her, but the lady simply vanished before them. After that, the captain fled the mansion, and the last thing he said about the event was that the woman really had a demonic expression on her face. These kinds of events continued to be constant in the mansion, but the next incident would be even more terrifying and would make this story famous. In 1936, two photographers were at the mansion taking pictures for a magazine article. They were walking through a hall when suddenly they noticed vapor coming out of one of the staircases. The photographers didn't know what was happening, but one of them, without thinking, took his camera, pointed it at the staircase, and quickly captured the event. In the photo, we see the grand staircase of Raynham Hall, and above it, one of the most disturbing and sinister portraits of the last centuries, the photo of the Brown Lady. This photo is considered one of the most frightening pieces of evidence of paranormal events. For many years, experts tried to debunk the photo, saying it was just a grease stain on the camera lens. Others said it was an effect known as double exposure, and some claimed the image was simply manipulated. But, to this day, no study has really been able to prove that the photo is fake. Charlie Noonan was a folklorist, someone who traveled and studied customs, traditions, and tales or events of places he visited. Charlie had traveled through the South and Southwestern United States during the early 20th century, accumulating various tales and stories about supernatural things. He always had an interest in his country's folklore, and along these journeys, he gathered many interesting things and photos. Between 1920 and 1930, Charlie visited a large number of villages. But let's say the place that most caught his attention was Louisiana, a state full of interesting legends and stories. During one of these trips, someone told him a legend about a strange farm in northwestern Oklahoma. The account he heard wasn't very clear, so a few days later, Charlie said goodbye to his wife and traveled to the place to learn more about this story. When he arrived there, he found a peasant who quickly mentioned a disturbing tale. This peasant told the legend of an old woman who lived in an abandoned house isolated in the middle of a field. She was a very reserved old lady who didn't usually talk to anyone, and people were afraid of her. The peasant couldn't explain the story well to Charlie, but mentioned that this old woman roamed the fields, plains, and farms of the region. She didn't talk to anyone, but when people crossed her path, she whispered things that people couldn't understand. Furthermore, villagers also mentioned that the police could never catch sight of her, and everyone thought that she wasn't really an old lady living in an abandoned house, but that there was something behind that woman. The residents believed that something very sinister was hidden behind her appearance. The peasant said to Charlie that the woman was always accompanied by an enormous German shepherd of unique oversized proportions. The peasant said the woman was short and hid her appearance under a hood. Her dog was very large and muscular, but never strayed from her. The few people who had seen her face directly described an intense and penetrating glow in her eyes, making everyone feel threatened and intimidated. I would say, in my opinion, it's a very interesting story, right? So Charlie was also fascinated and wanted to know more about this legend and, of course, to confirm if it was true. The problem was that the peasant couldn't say exactly where this abandoned house was located. So Charlie quickly left and began asking from house to house to find out if anyone knew the exact way to this location. It took a while, but eventually he got instructions on how to get there. The house was in a very remote area far from the population. He had to pass through a large forest and then cross a series of farms to find this mysterious house. So Charlie prepared, took his camera and the necessary items for the trip, and followed all the instructions. Upon reaching the forest and crossing the farms, he continued to walk for a long time, beginning to think he would find nothing. Since he couldn't see anything in the distance, only a vast field that seemed never-ending. But after continuing to advance, he noticed a house off in the distance. The house had a worn aspect, exactly as people had described it. Charlie was happy and prepared his camera and everything necessary to interview the supposed woman. He didn't believe this woman was wicked or anything. He thought that everything said about her were just legends and lies. But then something strange happened. Charlie never returned from that house in the middle of nowhere. No one ever heard from him again. In the following years, his wife searched for clues about his whereabouts. Unfortunately, they could never find anything useful. This left her devastated, and the case of Charlie became an unresolved mystery. So, advancing 10 years later, after the event, she had lost hope of finding her husband, until one day, a man knocked on her door. Upon opening the door, the man greeted her and mentioned being from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He informed that he owned a pawn shop, and without fully understanding what the man wanted to say, she listened as he told that a few days earlier, a strange guy who seemed like a homeless person came into the shop to pawn a camera he was carrying. The man explained that this guy was walking through the field around that region when he ended up finding a camera in the middle of nowhere. Upon picking up the camera, the shop owner noticed Charlie's name written on it. So he endeavored to find the original owner, leading him to her door. The man handed over the camera, said goodbye, and left. She felt happy. This was the most important find about her husband in the last 10 years. The first thing she thought was that maybe one of the photos on the camera could provide more clues about Charlie's whereabouts. So she took the film roll, which fortunately was intact, and rushed desperately to develop the photos. A few hours later, the photos were ready. She took them, and as she spread out the developed photos, one photo shocked her. In the photo, we can see an old woman with a dog in the middle of nowhere. The dog is in a kind of attack position, but if we zoom in on the woman's face, we can see a strange expression and bizarre glowing eyes. Sadly, they couldn't obtain more clues about Charlie, and this bizarre photo was the last thing found about him. In 2014, a photo was posted on the site Imgur, and the author of this photo, who uses the name Step Gold, began to give us context about what we were about to see. First, he explained that he was a man who worked in the United States Navy, a seasoned military man. Step says, "Last month, we entered a dry dock to carry out renovations and repairs." A dry dock is when a ship is taken into a lock. The doors are closed, and all the water is pumped out, leaving the ship high and dry on blocks, allowing repairs, inspections, etc. to be made to the bottom of the hull. Next to us was an old military frigate being dismantled. It had arrived about 2 weeks before us. Once the frigate was on the blocks and dry, the entire crew left it to its fate. A sad sight, but that's how things are. With this small text, we can see that this person really knows very specific details about ships. One could say he's someone we could trust, or maybe not, right? Who knows? He even shared some pictures from that day, confirming that what he was saying was true. In these photos, we can see the vessel being dismantled. Nothing out of the ordinary. So let's continue. Step continues with his account, telling us, Once all the delicate things were removed, the dock workers could continue. The dock foreman, John, went aboard first with a camera to take photographs of the work areas. The area where this photograph was taken was in a transverse alley inside the ship. He was walking with a flashlight and a camera. When taking a photo, he would turn off the flashlight, standing in complete darkness, and after taking the photo, he would turn it back on and keep walking. However, shortly after he shared the photo, the publication went viral on the site. Many people didn't know if it was true. There were some questions and doubts that people asked Stepp, and he updated his post. Many people are showing serious doubts about the authenticity of the image. As I said, I am also skeptical. This does not mean that I am not the author of the photo. It was sent to me. So it seems this photo caused many people to doubt. Stepp continued defending his story. Stepp kept saying that John took several photos and later sent them to his boss. But upon seeing this photo, his boss immediately called John and asked who the guy in the corner of the picture was. John had no idea. He had never seen anyone in the image. In the photo, we can see this man crouching, looking directly at the camera. His face can hardly be distinguished. We can see that he's wearing a jacket, and Stepp continues giving more information about the photo. He explains that because it was a military ship, they had to call the police to conduct an inspection. But after a few hours of searching, they couldn't find the person in the photo. Besides all this, he mentions that to enter and exit the ship, there was only one way. He says that this entry-exit was guarded by security cameras and that it was impossible for someone to escape from this ship as it was suspended 25 meters off the ground. Without a doubt, a great mystery. Stepp also mentions that when John told the story of the photo, he seemed nervous. Some people thought perhaps the person in the photo was one of the workers. The problem is that both knew all the workers perfectly, and they could never find any resemblance to anyone. Stepp finally bids farewell, telling us, "This gave me chills. I don't need to say I didn't go up aboard to take a look." He also mentions that if anyone is skilled with image retouching, he'd be very interested to see what can be extracted from it. After that, Stepp disappeared from the site, but a few days later, he returned to the post to make an update. A clean image of the face. All credit to my mate, Radicor Magnus Robot. Great job. But who was this man inside the ship, and what did he plan to do with that axe? I think we may never know. On May 23, 1964, in England, Jim Templeton and his daughter Elizabeth were preparing for a walk in a place called Burgh Marsh, located in the Solway Firth in the northwest of the country. It was a sunny day with perfect weather. Jim had been looking forward to this trip, as it had been weeks of hard work. When the day arrived, he planned to enjoy his family and rest as much as he could. Jim thought it would be a good idea to bring his camera to capture memories of that day. He even bought a new dress for Elizabeth, his daughter. Well, the family left home and headed to the place. A few hours later, Elizabeth and her mother were picking flowers in a large field, enjoying a peaceful summer day. Jim could see that his daughter and wife were very happy, so he took his camera and started taking some photos. But a little later, Jim noticed something curious. The dress Elizabeth was wearing matched the flowers she had picked in the field. So Jim took his daughter, sat her on the grass, and took 3 photos of her. As we can see, up to this moment, the day for the Templeton family was perfect. But a few days later, something happened. A few days later, Jim took his camera and decided to develop the photos. In a few hours, the photos were ready. Jim took them home and began to look at them one by one. But when he got to the last photo of that day in the field, he found something unexpected. In his hand, he had a photo where Elizabeth was sitting sideways, looking directly at the camera and smiling. But behind her, there was something strange. Jim noticed that there was a strange figure standing right behind his daughter. In the photo, we can see that the figure is wearing some kind of white suit, and it seems to be a helmet or a visor. Jim tried to remember if there was anyone else with them that day, but after reflecting, he concluded that in that field, only his family and an elderly couple in a car were present. These other people had nothing strange or wore anything resembling the figure in the photo. So what was this figure in the picture, and how did it appear there? Jim didn't understand how he had captured that being. The next thing he did was take the photo to the police to ask if astronauts or someone from the government was performing any project in that area. The officers simply said no, and that nothing unusual had been reported in that area. The first thing they thought when seeing the photograph was that maybe the person who developed the photos had accidentally used some substance that spoiled the photo. The days passed, and the photo gained fame. The media and newspapers quickly learned about it. Jim's photo had become very famous, and it was then that countless debates began about it. This case was so popular that it drew the attention of the Kodak company, the same company that manufactured the camera Jim had used to take the photo. The analysts of the company asked Jim to send the film to their London facilities, and a few days later, they confirmed that the photo was real. They even offered a large amount of money for anyone who could prove that the photo had been tampered with. But after days, months, and years, no one ever claimed that reward. Over 5 decades, the image became public domain. Thousands of letters from around the world were received with various ideas and suggestions, but most of them didn't make sense. Some people said that what appeared in the photo was a spirit. Others believed that Jim or his daughter had psychic powers they were unaware of, which I find a bit far-fetched, right? There were also theories that this photo might be a montage, but to this day, no one could understand what happened that day and why we see this figure behind Elizabeth. To make the case even more mysterious, Jim later declared that he was visited by 2 men dressed in black. They claimed to work for the British government, but refused to show their identification, identifying themselves only as number 9 and number 11. These supposed men in black wanted to know the location and circumstances in which the photo was taken, but never visited Jim again. Additionally, Jim reported that at that time, the Blue Streak missile, built by the British Royal Air Force, was about to be launched in South Australia, but was aborted at the last moment because 2 figures wearing some special suits were seen at the site. Even so, none of this confirms what we really have in this photo. This case is known as the Solway Firth Spaceman. And with this story, we come to the end of this video. But leave a comment. Have you heard any of these stories or seen the photos I mentioned in this video? I want to know how you discovered them or if you've heard different stories. Don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe. Anyway, may God bless you all, and until next time.